This is your ultimate guide to every Team Fortress 2 NPC ever mentioned anywhere in the lore, all the way from the Administrator to Zepheniah and everyone in between. Every character who has had more than a name ever given to them, and even a few without. And we start off our list with a bit of a surprising character, none other than 16th President of the United States, Abe Lincoln, who is referenced a ton of times in the TF2 lore, and not just in the context of being president. In fact, he is heavily implied to be the original Team Pyro, from when the first mercenaries were employed back in 1850. Honest Abe is also proudly declared as the inventor of literal staircases in the year 1857. However, and you're gonna get pretty used to hearing me say this as this video goes on, there is a lore paradox or perhaps a retcon here, because this invention also apparently resulted in his death, as he tried to rocket jump up them. Rocket jumping, of course, being something that we would expect from the soldier, not the original Pyro. And then we've got a second layer of paradox, because on the in-game gunmetal campaign coin, it says that Abe invented the rocket jump itself, not the staircase, despite the lore page that talks about his staircase invention saying that rocket jumps were invented in the 1700s, a century before Lincoln was even born. And guess what? We've got a third layer of paradox here, because in multiple places, it is confirmed that the TF2 universe Lincoln actually died by the hand of an in-universe John Wilkes Booth, similar to the Lincoln from our real world, so very much not via rocket jumping. And of course, also not during the Gravel Wars, which we can assume would have happened if he was the original Pyro. I'm not sure if we can really take any of these versions as the absolute Team Fortress canon here, but one thing's for sure, that the writers really love Abraham Lincoln, for one reason or another. The Administrator. Alphabeticized here by her title, not by her name, because despite her name being teased for over an actual decade and a half of real-world lore releases, the 7th and final comic pretty much tells us that her name is specifically not Helen nor Elizabeth, the two names that we know that she used during her years active in our story. The name Emily is also mentioned in Comic 7, although today you won't find any trace of this name's origins in the comics or otherwise. I am 95% sure at this point that Emily was just an error printed on release date in the loose canon comic, which was immediately corrected. And the only evidence of this which seems to exist today, other than people just saying, "Trust me bro," is a Korean fan translation published shortly after the original English, which does indeed have the name translated as Emily. If you've got any stronger proof than this, other than contemporaneous hearsay, for the origins of Emily, I would love to see it. Anyway, when the Administrator was a child, Zepheniah Mann probably caused the death of her parents. From then on, her entire existence became about getting revenge on him. She starts by getting a job at his English manor house, working as the governess for his twin sons Redmond and Blutarch. In order to make Zepheniah suffer, she then spends the next 30 years intentionally raising the sons to be the biggest idiots that she possibly can. As a proud family businessman, having his sons grow up to be useless businessmen is a guaranteed way to cause Zepheniah pain. Later on, the Administrator becomes Zephaniah's personal maidservant, and in her final act before he dies, she convinces him to sign over his land to the twin sons that she had spent the last 30 years raising to be as stupid as possible, guaranteeing that the sons will waste his wealth and ruin his family name, even after his death. However, once Zepheniah is dead and no longer suffering, the Administrator soon gets bored and depressed, because watching Zepheniah suffer seems to have been her only life goal. So with nothing left to live for, she makes her own exit from the world of the living. But this doesn't last long, because Grey Man shows up and Deus Ex Machinas her back to life with Australium, and that is how she actually gets the iconic grey streak in her hair. After learning that Australium can resurrect the dead, she is struck with a new reason to live. Use the magic metal to bring Zepheniah back as well and torture him for as long as possible by force-feeding him Australium until the world's supply literally runs out. At some point in time, this portrait appears in the Mann family mansion, which can be found hidden in the Mann Manor, the in-game version of the family house that she lives in after Zepheniah's death. This probably doesn't imply any sort of intimate relationship between her and Zeph, but who knows what ends she would have gone to for revenge. At some point after that, she sets up the company TF Industries, which buys weapons from Manco and funds the Gravel War between the red and blue teams. And the entire time that the Gravel Wars exist, she is forcing Zepheniah Mann to watch his idiot sons ruin his family empire for generations. We're never told her exact age, but we do know that she was an adult from at least 1822, all the way up to around 1972, meaning that she probably lived to around 170 or 180 years old. In the end, when the Australium runs out, her and Zepheniah rapidly disintegrate like any real 170-year-old human bodies probably should, and she triumphantly declares that the century of wasted time was every bit as satisfying as she wanted it to be. There's one thing I really need to know. What the hell was in those census and genealogy records teased in the earlier comics? They make a big show of these apparently meaning something, only for Grey to show up at the end and say, actually her identity is none of those, and then nothing? Capen, please! Barnabus Hale is arguably the most important member of the Hale family, because it's he who first took control of Manco, resulting in Saxton Hale owning it 2 generations later, because Barnabus is Saxton's grandfather. Whilst we don't know much about his birth, death, or family members outside of his son Bilious and grandson Saxton, we do know that he worked as Zepheniah Mann's tracker and aide, as that's what he's referred to in Zephaniah's will. And it was Barnabas' natural medicine experience that helped Zepheniah in his final days, and is part of the reason that Zepheniah left Manco to Barnabas in the first place. Barnabas was also present at the birth of the 3 Mann sons, Redmond, Blutarch, and Grey, and he is the only person shown to mourn the death of the boy's mother, Bette. But perhaps more interestingly is that Bette was the daughter of someone named William Darling, making it very likely that Barnabas knew or was at least aware of this William Darling. We don't know anything more about William, but it certainly seems likely that he is an ancestor of Charles Darling, who we will learn about shortly, suggesting that the Hale-Darling relationship is much older than just Saxton and Charles, and a generations-old family relationship might help explain why Charles ends up as Saxton's mentor as opposed to Saxton's own father, who we're just about to meet. However, alphabetically speaking, we must first meet Bette Mann, the mother of Redmond, Blutarch, and Grey, and the wife of Zepheniah. And in many ways, her life had just as much influence on how the boys turned out as the fathers did, because she unfortunately died during childbirth, delivering the 3 young Manns. But it's precisely because of her sad passing that the 2 remaining boys, that is, the 2 that weren't stolen by a passing eagle, needed a mother to look after them, which means, in this 19th century upper-class English family, a governess or a nanny. And thus, this was the opening that the mysterious administrator needed to walk into Zepheniah Mann's life and exact revenge for, well, whatever it was he did. Other than her untimely death and the identities of her children, her unloving husband, and of course her father William Darling, that's sadly all we know about the mother of Manns. But now, we return again to the Hale family for the last time until Saxton, much further down this list, with Saxton's father Bilious, son of Barnabas, who we met a moment ago. It appears that Barnabas handed his ownership of Manco down to Bilious, just as Bilious will eventually do to Saxton. And fortunately for us lore lovers, Bilious actually has an in-game museum in his honor that exists in the NVM map Coaltown, so let's pay it a visit. He helped subdue Abraham Lincoln's assassin and got the assassin's hat as a reward. He introduced the world to coal-powered hats. He helped mine for coal by literally punching it out of the seams. It turns out they actually bought the coal mine from Redmond and Blutarch for a nickel. He was CEO when Manco was voted the safest workplace in the Badlands. He was also CEO when Manco became the exclusive weapon supplier to the mercs fighting the gravel bores. He punched his way out of a mine collapse that unfortunately saw 14 of his employees lose their lives. And he is ultimately still there when deciding to shut the mine down just under 61 years after he bought it. Needless to say, I would love to be able to read the small print in all of these news articles, but what I'm really curious about is what led to him not mentoring his own son Saxton, and then how exactly Charles Darling ended up in that role instead. We'll learn about Charles after this next kooky couple. Bil-bel and Lar-nah are Sniper's birth parents, and they, just like Sniper, are New Zealanders, not Australians. And Sniper's birth name is Mundy, styled like theirs. And New Zealand, in the Team Fortress universe, is in a giant glass dome at the bottom of the ocean. Sniper's dad, Bil-bel, is, believe it or not, a really important figure in New Zealand, because it was him who convinced the government to sink the country to the bottom of the sea in the glass dome in the first place. Unfortunately, however, everyone in New Zealand drowned when baby Sniper escaped in a rocket and broke a hole in the dome. Bil-bel and Lar-nah, however, did survive by locking themselves in Bil-bel's watertight laboratory. The pair then spent the next few decades growing to hate each other more than they already did. When the Mercs and Pauling show up at the lab to try and find the world's last remaining stash of Australium, which they believe is hiding there, Bil-bel ends up escaping with the gang's submarine, and he repeats his actions that he did with the Kiwi population by leaving them all to drown. And then we never see him again. Lar-nah, on the other hand, also escapes this situation by leaving in a space rocket, built out of the very Australium that the Mercs were there to collect. We finally see her in the frigid cold of space, where she likely passes away sometime later, assuming she didn't of course drown herself in wine first. When Sniper was a baby and escaped in a rocket of his own a couple of decades earlier, he ended up being adopted by a nice couple of Australians who Miss Pauling calls Mr. and Mrs. Mundy. Given that Sniper's birth name is Mundy and his adopted family name is Mundy, that means his full name is actually Mundy Mundy. A happy coincidence or a retcon-worthy oversight? You decide. B is by far the TF2 writer's favourite letter to start names with, so we're going to be moving through the alphabet much quicker from here, kicking off with the aforementioned Charles Darling. Now, I truly believe that Darling is one of the most interesting Team Fortress story characters. As we've already covered, his ancestor appears to be the Mann triplets' mother's father, which would actually make him a blood relative of the Mann family. And despite us knowing a lot about Saxton's real father, we know that Darling for some reason took on the role of Saxton's mentor when he was younger. On top of that, in the middle of the story, when everything is still very much a mystery, Darling shows us that he's got advanced knowledge of the administrator's activities that Saxton, Miss Pauling, and even Grey Man aren't aware of. Despite his younger mentorship of Saxton, at some time before our main story timeline starts, Charles and Saxton fall out so badly that Saxton has done a full 180 on Charles and now considers him his nemesis. You see, whilst Saxton thinks of animals as beings which exist purely for men to fistfight them, Charles instead wants to capture and put them on display in zoos, and use Australium to keep them alive forever, which Saxton simply thinks sucks. This is the reason that Charles is tracking the administrator's activities, because he's after the same Australian that she is. But we never find out how he's tracking her. And to add to this mysterious man's mystery even more, despite showing up a ton in flashbacks in the final comic, there's absolutely no mention of what he's up to now in the main timeline. Where is Darling now? And what has he been doing for the past 7 years after it was believed that the Australium had run out? Does his advanced knowledge extend to the Australium eventually found in Soldier's Cave, which we are led to believe that Pauling dumps in the ocean? And what happens if Darling finds it? Now here's a guy only the nerdiest of Team Fortress nerds out there will know, Claude Huggins. He's the founder of the town of Hugginsville, or as you and I better know it these days, Two Fort. The story goes that Claude and his wife wandered the wild west of the New Mexico Badlands until they were attacked by a bear, wherein his wife sadly died, and he hid under her corpse until the bear left. So he decided to found the town of Hugginsville on that very spot. Sometime after the town was established, a group of young bullies showed up and changed the town's name to Two Farts. Too scared to change the name all the way back, Claude decided to only change it slightly, and that's why we have Two Fort as we know it today. An extremely niche reference from a single page in comic number 3, beautifully acknowledged in a tiny background detail in comic number 7. A couple of years later, the administrator and the Mann family show up in what is now named Two Fort, and from that point on, every one of the game's canonical battles take place in and around this town. Perhaps even the long-abandoned RD asteroid might have somehow had its ties to the Hugginsville lore. And believe it or not, Claude Huggins is actually memorialized on an in-game item, specifically the Gunmetal campaign's bronze medal, where he is celebrated for his proud legacy of hiding. Now, I've decided to refer to this lady as Mrs. Degroot, because she's the demo man's mother and his name is Tavish Finnegan Degroot. Well, at least he calls her his mother. When I mentioned retcons and contradiction coming up more in this video, it was mostly this lady I was thinking of. But first, here is a little bit of her background which we are confident about. We know from the several times that we meet her in the comics that she is obsessed with her son getting a job, despite them already being super rich from his time as a TF Industries mercenary. Like, look at this house where they live together. In fact, it's her demands for him to get a job at only 7 years old that led to him to lose his eye to the Bombonomicon when working as a cleaner at Merasmus' castle. Now, the confusing part here is whether she really is his mother at all. You see, some of the richest lore that we have on the 9 playable classes, which I cover in great detail in an earlier video, I'll link in the description, comes from 3 places. Their official website blurbs, their official action figure boxes, and their official trading cards which are published on the teamfortress.com blog. Demo's official trading card says that a failed plan to blow up the Loch Ness Monster killed his birth parents. The official website says that this event killed his original adoptive parents, and his official action figure box makes no mention of his parents dying at all. And of course, if we take the comics as the truest version of the story, and we can clearly see that his mum was 100% alive, and they specifically mention that only his dad is dead. What exactly can we call the official canon when at least 3 official sources all kind of contradict each other? Maybe that's why he's got a weapon called the loose cannon. General Patton Doe and Georgia Washington Doe are Soldier and Zhanna's children, born sometime after the squad defeated Gray Man and took back control of Manco. For the most part, we see them embodying much of the chaos and violence that we know and love their parents for. And whilst of course not blood-related, Merasmus is referred to as their uncle, which I think is just a lovely little cherry on the cake of Soldier and Merasmus's complicated relationship, which we'll examine more later. I'm also going to include Scout's children here because we don't have names for most of them. He's got 4 kids, 2 girls, and 2 boys. And between them, they are implied to be from at least 3 different mothers, none of whom are still around, so Scout is raising them alone, and he appears to be doing a pretty good job. We only know this little one's name, which is Tanya, a traditionally Slavic name that is perhaps a nod to Scout's longtime colleague who is known for wearing a similar outfit. And it is also this young Tanya for whom Spy takes off his mask, and why we finally got to see the handsome rogue's full face. It's also worth reminding everyone here that Spy is Scout's father. Again, see my earlier video for more info on that bombshell. So that means that what we're seeing here is actually a lovely moment between a grandfather and his granddaughter. Next up, we've got the main antagonist of the entire story, Gray Man. His parents are Bette and Zepheniah, and the age that he died is 150. And therefore, surprisingly, he's got at least one child that we know of, Olivia Mann. His siblings are of course his triplet brothers, Redmond and Blutarch. However, it is important to note that he actually grew up separately from these twin brothers because he was stolen at birth by an eagle. Gray Man is shown to be incredibly intelligent. He is so intelligent, in fact, that he actually taught himself to speak English by listening whilst in the womb. Thus, he was born able to fully articulate his thoughts out loud. He is the creator of the killer robots that players fight against in the in-game man vs. machine mode, and he even invented his own Australium life-extending machines at least 20 years before Engineer's grandfather, who we'll also be talking about shortly. In fact, Gray is the first person we know to even learn about Australium's life-extending and life-saving properties, and he starts stockpiling it as early as 1850. But in a truly legendary act of self-sabotage, he uses some of the magic metal to revive a then naturally middle-aged administrator, and he tells her about its powers, thus accidentally creating his own arch-rival, whom he'll fight for access to the world supply of Australium for the next 120 years or so. His motivation seems to primarily be to simply get even more Australium so he can continue extending his life. After taking over Manco so he can try and claim the stockpiles of the metal held in the company indirectly by the administrator, we find out that his next plan of action was to deploy blood-sucking robots that could suck any trace amounts of the powerful element from the blood of the living Australian population. Despite his intelligence and ability to dodge death for 150 years, he is eventually killed by his own mercenary, who simply rips Gray's Australian machine off his back, causing him to instantly age around 150 years and die shortly after. Next, we hop, skip and jump to the alphabet all the way down to M, with the lovely Margaret, better known as Maggie or Mags. She's been married at least 4 times. However, the only man who could ever keep up with her intense need to fistfight with wild animals and bully hippies was of course Mr. Australia himself, Saxton Hale. But of course, anyone familiar with the comics will know that Saxton's dedication to running Manco always got in the way of his dedication to her. For all the fans of True Love watching though, this story does have a happy ending. Because by the time that the timeline fast forwards 7 years in the final comic, Saxton finally realizes his foolishness and he abandons Manco and runs to Maggie and now commits to giving her his undivided attention. Whilst we don't really know much more than that about Maggie's personal background, it's clear that she, and especially her relationship with Saxton, is something that the writers considered very special, because they decided to conclude the entire story with this powerful scene of Saxton and Maggie fighting cheetahs well into old age. In fact, Maggie and Saxton are the last known surviving members of the entire story, as this scene is implied to take place today, 2025 and beyond. The pair of lovers leave us with this beautifully poignant line. You want to live forever? Maybe one day we'll find out if they did. Merasmus is one of TF2's oldest non-player characters. In fact, he's over 6,000 years old. Whilst of course being an ancient wizard in control of powerful eldritch magic, he somehow constantly finds himself in debt to various criminal organizations. Throughout his various comic appearances, he owes debt to the Japanese mafia, the Korean mafia, and the Russian mob. In fact, it's one of these criminal debts that results in him finally shuffling off this mortal coil, if we can even call a 6,000-year-old wizard mortal, that is. We'll discuss that in a moment, but first, let's talk about his younger years. Well, his less old years. Merasmus is by far the NPC with the largest in-game presence, being the fully modelled and voiced boss of multiple Halloween maps, but his story primarily plays out in the events of the Halloween Update tie-in comics. We first meet him as the keeper of the demon book the Bombernomicon, which of course goes on to haunt the Demoman's eye socket. But Merasmus is most commonly found interacting with the soldier with whom he was roommates, and no matter what Merasmus does, Soldier seems to constantly make life difficult for him. Including when Soldier breaks the neck of Welsh pop legend Tom Jones, who surprisingly we'll also be talking about in a minute, and then frames Merasmus for the murder, resulting in the agent magician finding himself in a United States prison. During his 7 years behind bars, Merasmus gets jacked as heck. But strangely, despite being both physically extremely capable and also a literal wizard with command of multiple styles of powerful magic, he still finds himself captured and tortured to death by one of the criminal enterprises that he owes money to. But that is not the end of Merasmus, because he uses his powers as a ghost to haunt a brick, which, along with Tom Jones's ghost in a separate brick, now lives in Soldier's trousers for the rest of Soldier's natural life, and presumably beyond. Olivia Mann is an extremely mysterious character, and I'm convinced that there was originally a bigger plan for her. By the end of the comics, she is the only known surviving member of the entire Mann family. Her father was Grey Mann, and her mother is unknown, as well as just how exactly Grey, who was around 143 years old at the time of her birth, even did the deed to create her. This led to some early speculation that she might actually be a clone, or potentially a much older person who has consumed a lot of Australian. Olivia becomes the owner of Manco after beating Saxton Hale in a fist fight that he simply refuses to take part in because, well, she's just a little girl. And it's this that sets in motion basically the entire story, because as Grey Mann's daughter, the company effectively falls into his hands. Despite this absolutely crucial plot point that she plays a major role in, she basically disappears for the next 6 comics. In fact, until the finale, we only see Olivia in 2 more scenes, and both times she's just a background character. The first is this, where she is directly alongside Grey as they look for the administrator's supply of Australium, fueling speculation that she's got a personal interest in the powerful metal's properties. And then the second is where the infamous Helen identity documents are discussed, and this time suggesting that she might have a personal interest or connection to the administrator's identity. Of course, as I already alluded to, none of this is ever explored any further, and she doesn't get mentioned again even in passing for another 4 entire comic issues. But anyway, when Grey dies, Saxton for some reason becomes Olivia's legal guardian. 7 years later, despite her still being Mann co-owner, Saxton somehow fires her and gives her a trust fund, and that's it. No more character development, no more explanations of the past, she's just a normal 14-year-old girl, it seems. As the final survivor of the Mann lineage that we know of, surely there's more going on here. Well, it looks like we'll never know for sure, but I'm sure the speculation will never end. Miss Flo Pauling, and I'm including her alphabetically here as P because, of course, we know her much better by her surname than her first. Her job is one of the many assistants to the administrator's company TF2's, and she's worked there for around 10 years. But despite how important she is to our story, the 7th comic shows us that she's so low down in the company's ranks that the receptionist can't even find her in the system. Either that, or her role is so super important that she's simply working off the books. Either way, she is unbelievably dedicated to her job. She's willing to kill, and even willing to die for it. However, she still seems to be someone with a social life, and even in her introductory comic, she talks about her friends. But where we learn the most about Miss Pauling's social life is through her in-game voice lines, of which there are literally hundreds. For example, she goes wine tasting with Spy, she takes psychedelics with Sniper, she enters a hot dog eating contest with the Engineer, she takes a sightseeing tour of the town of Twofort, and she even goes to an assistants conference with Saxton Hale's assistant Bidwell, who we're going to talk about in a bit. However, all of this is kind of contradicted by a dating ad which appears to be taken out in her name, where she says that she works 364 days a year. Unless, of course, you consider all of those things work. But what none of these interactions tell us is what happens to Pauling at the end of the main story. Once the gang beat the baddies and take control back of Manco, Pauling has a deep and meaningful conversation with Engineer and then quietly disappears. We know she's alive because she sends the gang a turkey, but why isn't she there herself? Why did the writers feel it was so important to specifically show her as not present at the party? Is she running TF Industries now? And if not, who is? And the question that is played on my mind ever since reading that final comic issue. Do we know that she definitely dumped Soldier's Cave Australium in the ocean? What a better way to follow up the legendary Miss Pauling than the even more legendary Poopy Joe? And I'm not being completely jokey there, because Poopy Joe is actually one of the first ever characters revealed in the lore. In fact, he was introduced to us at the same time as Saxton Hale, the Administrator, and Miss Pauling. He's that much of an OG. His story goes like this. Manco and TF Industries worked with the American government to launch a monkey into space, and most crucially, the space rocket was going to be powered by Australium. Tragically, however, the rocket exploded on the launch pad, taking our dear monkey Nort with it. This is the narrative that is played out in the in-game matches on the map Doomsday. There's even a secret room on the map showing a newspaper article, and there's even this wonderfully detailed lunchbox and spacesuit with the American hero's initials. But the failed launch was not an accident, and it seems that the Administrator planned the whole thing, and instead of using the Australium to fuel the rocket as was expected, she staged the explosion and stole the Australium for herself. And, well, we all know why. Poopy Joe is actually even associated with one of the rarest types of item in the game, a fully released but 100% unobtainable hat called the Never Forget. Is it fair to call an item rare if it's actually in 0 backpacks? Radigan Conagher is Engineer's grandfather and arguably much more important to the Team Fortress world than NG himself, because it was Radigan who created the Australian machines for Redmond, Blutarch, and a mystery third person, presumably the Administrator. It's entirely thanks to Radigan that the Gravel Wars continued for over a century, and that the timeline of TF2 even exists. NG also reveals that his father, so Radigan's son, also worked for TF Industries. As far as we know, a family history of working at TF Industries is completely unique to the Engineer's bloodline, as none of the other Merc's parents that we know about have any prior connection to the company. That only makes it all the more unusual that our team is canonically F tier, given that our Engineer's grandfather is the only reason that the Gravel Wars didn't fizzle out around a century earlier. And if that F tier comic doesn't mean anything to you, then check out my video on the secrets of the final comic to know more. Mr. Reddy and Mr. Bidwell are Saxton Hale's assistants, and they bring us yet another B name in the Team Fortress canon, but we tend to refer to the teams as Red and Blue as opposed to Blue and Red, which is why I've mentioned the pair down here. With that said, Reddy and Bidwell have no obvious individual connection to the warring Red and Blue teams, although I've always suspected that at one point they were planned to be before Redmond and Blutarch were ultimately introduced, a pair who I'll be introducing in just a moment. My suspicions of their originally planned importance is strengthened by the fact that Bidwell even gets a name check in one of the very first pre-story comic titles. And canonically, it was his idea for the Manconomy update that changed the future of TF2, and let's be honest, the entire genre of free-to-play games, forever. Throughout that comic and all the others, Reddy and Bidwell are shown to be highly competent assistants to Hale's wild requests, including providing sizzling hot breakfast steaks, facilitating his fistfights with hippies, and helping ensure that his 14-year-old adoptive daughter Olivia Mann does not become an underage alcoholic. In the end, Reddy and Bidwell's competence is perhaps what motivates Hale to give the entire company of Manco to Bidwell, which he declines in an act of politeness, befitting of only a Brit, or maybe even a Canadian. So Saxton instead gives the company to Reddy, who doesn't make the same mistake. Bidwell, immediately regretting this decision, suggests to Reddy that they could co-own, although we're never shown exactly how this conversation ended. But regardless, at the end of the story, Manco appears to be now in their capable hands. As the story developed, we of course know that the actual figureheads of the Red and the Blue teams are Redmond and Blutarch Mann. Their parents are Bette and Zepheniah Mann, and they were born in 1822 and died 150 years later. They were killed by their third triplet brother Gray by being simply stabbed in the back. Their careers saw them as the employers of the Red and the Blue mercenary teams respectively, instructing those teams to fight over the land that Team Fortress the game takes place on. Red and Blue weren't raised by their parents, but instead the Administrator, who at the time was a nanny and a maid. And as we know, she intentionally raised the boys to be squabbling idiots in an act of vengeance against their father Zepheniah for reasons we can only guess. When their father Zepheniah died, in his will, he bequeathed to the twins the land on which TF2's in-game events take place, and he left it to them equally. As a result, and because the administrator raised them stupid, the boys then spent the entire rest of their lives trying to beat the other brother and claim the land, employing the red and blue mercenaries to do the fighting for them. After 40 years of this, the administrator showed up with the Australian machine she commissioned Radigan to build and gave one to each of them, thus extending the gravel wars for another couple of generations. And when Redmond and Blutarch died after being backstabbed by Grey, they carried on fighting each other, each believing that they haven't truly lost the battle with the other brother until their ghost is banished to Hell, thus the events of the Scream Fortress map, Hell Tower. Needless to say, the administrator was very successful in raising them as idiots. Saxton Hale, Australianness level over 9,000. He is the CEO and owner of Manco, which he inherited from his father Bilious, who inherited it from his father Barnabus. Saxton may be the most manly man who ever manned. He loves steak, and he's even converted his office desk into a grill. He loves fighting stuff, but only with his fists, like a real man, and he even makes a move on the administrator and Miss Pauling the first time we meet them properly. In fact, the phrasing here even suggests that he and the administrator have a history together, although this idea is never explored any further in the years of comics that would follow. But maybe what he loves most of all is Maggie. Or maybe it's his company, Manco. And it's the fact that he can't decide between the two which motivates almost his entire story arc throughout the comics. And as we discussed in earlier chapters, Saxton lost control of Manco in a fistfight with 7-year-old Olivia. And then 7 years after that, he eventually fires Olivia to take back control of Manco himself, only to immediately give the company over to Reddy and Bidwell. And he does all of this because he's tired of running. Tired of running the company, and tired of running away from what his heart really wants. Mags. So he finally leaves to be with her for good this time. And as we know, Saxton Hale is still alive today, 2025 and beyond. Well, at least this is where we last saw him. Old and in love, but still doing what he does best, fighting ferocious predators with his bare Australian arms. Our final Mann family member is Silas Mann, who is probably the horseless headless horseman, and he is probably this person in the family portrait, and he is probably not Zepheniah Mann's brother, but he is definitely dead. Let me explain. Silas's name only ever appears twice, anywhere in TF2's lore. First on this gravestone, alongside the quote, "A long-lost Mann family member returns," introducing the horseless headless horseman, implying that the dead man and the horseman are one and the same, but without saying so directly. And even more interestingly, a secret link in the gravestone on the update page reveals this second half of the Mann family portrait, implying that he might be this character by the fireplace, but again without saying so directly, so another interpretation is that he's this man in the middle. The man who, despite both halves of the picture being revealed, remains hidden to this day, even so far as being trolled about in the final comic issue. The second and only other time that Silas's name is ever mentioned anywhere in the lore ever again is on this tiny newsletter with his name alongside Zephaniah's, listed as a co-owner of Manco. This equal billing as owner of Manco and the apparent age of this person in the family portrait led most people to assume that Silas is simply Zephaniah's brother. But in the final comic, Zepheniah claims that he has no brothers. So who really was Silas? Just a Mann cousin? Or could he possibly be an older brother to Red, Blue and Grey? Believe it or not, our next character is sex bomb sensation Tom Jones, who is actually a massively recurring character in the Team Fortress comics. For starters, Scout is obsessed with him, partly because he thinks that Tom Jones is his real dad. As a result, Scout's entire bank vault is filled with Tom Jones merchandise, and he even has a misspelled TJ tattoo. Pretty early on, the real, actual Tom Jones shows up as roommates with none other than the 6,000-year-old eldritch wizard Merasmus, and as we already know, is then murdered by Soldier, with Merasmus ultimately being framed and going to prison for. Strangely, the writers give Tom Jones a Cockney accent, despite him being from a literal different country to where that accent originates. To put this in perspective, this is kind of like giving a Canadian character Foghorn Leghorn's accent, which is to say that it's funny, but only in the sense of how bizarrely wrong it is. Poor Tom is then double murdered in heaven by an actual angel to prevent a near-death experiencing Scout finding out the truth that Tom is not his actual father. But to maintain the illusion, the spy, who of course is Scout's actual father, disguises himself as Tom Jones just before that near-death experience so that Scout can die believing that the real Tom really was his dad all along. Despite being double-deaded, there's still arguably a happy ending for the old-school pop star, because he goes on to become a ghost haunting a brick that lives in Soldier's pants, living alongside the ghost of Merasmus in his own haunted brick. Now that is unusual. We are so close to the end of our A to Z now, and we've got Yana and Bronislava, two of Heavy's three sisters, and yet another B name that I relegated to elsewhere in the list to try and keep things spicy. We first meet this pair at the Heavy family's Siberian lodge, alongside his mother and Zhanna, who we'll talk about in her own section. We only get a little peek into their personalities here, but we do learn that they at some point took revenge on the men who held the family at a gulag when they were younger. The second and final time that we meet them is at the massive holiday gathering at the very end of Comic 7, where they show up with Heavy's elderly mum still keeping on, and where both the sisters are unsubtly flirtatious with some of our squad. And it is in fact Bronislava who is responsible for the cute, candid Polaroid shots that make up some of the very last comic panels that we'll ever get to enjoy. Zepheniah Mann, our penultimate NPC, and easily the most important man in the TF2 universe. Firstly, because he founded Manco, and secondly, because he died. I'll explain that in a moment. His cause of death was pretty much every ailment imaginable, and his age at death was his 50s or his 60s. The age that he was brought back to life, 50s or 60s plus 1. Age that he died again, over 150. Zepheniah spent most of his very extended existence being kept alive by Australium for the administrator's amusement, and he was actively tortured by her by being forced to watch your gameplay. That's official canon, I'm sorry. And unfortunately for him, the best thing that he ever did for us was die the first time, because the entire story of TF2 that ran for all of these years was set up by one single piece of paper. Zephaniah's last will and testament. In this document, he left his weapons company to Saxton's granddad, which is why we have Manco today. He left his land to his twin sons equally, which is why we have the red and blue teams and the gravel wars today. In other words, the reason the actual gameplay of TF2 exists. And he left his Australium foolishly to his maid, the administrator, who used that same Australium to keep him alive and torture him for over a century. So just remember, no matter how bad of a day you might be having, at least you haven't made a blunder that big. And last but not least is the amazing Zhanna, who is by far the biggest Team Fortress character without any in-game presence. Her home is the Zhugzhe Mountains in Siberia, and along with her mother, her older brother Mikhail, the Heavy, and her two sisters Yana and Bronislava, they all escaped a horrific gulag when they were much younger. Either in spite of this trauma, or perhaps as a result of it, she ends up falling very quickly in love with our soldier shortly after meeting him, and then spends the remainder of the comics as an absolute main character alongside the rest of the squad. By the end of the final mission, Zhanna and Soldier have already got engaged, the ring being a pin from a live grenade. When the timeline skips forward 7 years, we see that they've got two kids together who we of course met earlier, General Patton Doe and Georgia Washington Doe. Much of Zhanna's time with the team is spent doing weird and gory things with the soldier, even cutting off her own hand to escape some handcuffs. And there's a really cool touch that the artists and writers included in the final comic, because we actually see her with a robot hand when the timeline skips forward 7 years. I guess whilst they were all at Grey's headquarters, they simply couldn't make it to a vet's clinic in enough time to reattach her hand, just like they did for her husband several chapters earlier. What you're seeing on screen right now is even more TF2 NPCs. Some who even have names, but who I just felt didn't have quite enough information out there to justify a whole chapter in this video. If your favourite character is here, or even better if they're not here, then I've got great news for you. Because this means that your headcanon or even your fanfic about them is pretty much free to be whatever you want it to be. If you enjoyed this and want a similar treatment for the playable mercs, check out the video linked on screen right now. And if you want to know about some things you might have missed in the final comic specifically, check this other video linked on screen right now, and be sure to subscribe if you love Team Fortress videos.